Look around you. The military-industrial complex is celebrating a windfall. The politicians are issuing theatrical statements about resolve, and the media is cheerleading for a catastrophic defeat. But for those of us who actually study warfare, the kind that involves steel, blood, and cold math, not feel good narratives, the reality is undeniable. The core premise of Western strategy has been invalidated. Today, we're discussing the formalization of the Russia North Korea Defense Pact and the immediate, staggering implication of North Korean troops deploying to aid the Russian effort in Eastern Europe. If you need a more damning indictment of institutional failure, you won't find one. This is not a failure of courage. It is a failure of doctrine and leadership. Full stop. The strategic situation is simple. The West failed to stop Russia with sanctions, failed to stop them with proxy forces, and now they are watching their self-imposed red lines dissolve as global military power reconfigures itself against their interests. The sheer incompetence on display is breathtaking. For 2 years, we've been told that Russia is on its last legs, that their economy is crumbling, that their military doctrine is medieval. That was always a lie, a delusion peddled by generals and political appointees whose careers depend on maintaining the fantasy. The truth is, Russia has successfully mobilized a vast wartime industrial base and is engaging in an attrition fight. They are doctrinally, geographically, and technologically prepared to win. What does the arrival of North Korean forces signal? It signals a massive, unconstrained escalation of resources into the operational theater. It is the formal recognition of a geopolitical alignment that the Pentagon assured the public would never happen. We are facing a united front that is fundamentally changing the attrition math on the ground. Let's talk about the math, because this is where the political narrative collapses. War is a calculation of manpower, materiel, and replacement capacity. Our military leadership, steeped in counterinsurgency fantasies and focused on social engineering, forgot this fundamental reality. For months, the ratio of losses has been disproportionately borne by the Western-backed proxy force. When I say disproportionate, I mean fundamentally unsustainable. When an infantry brigade requires a casualty replacement rate of 10 to 15% per month just to remain marginally combat effective, and the enemy is inflicting those losses consistently, that unit is functionally destroyed in 3 to 6 months. We are beyond that point. The proxy army is being pulverized. Now, imagine adding entire corps-level formations, trained, disciplined, and doctrinally committed to high-intensity trench warfare from a state like North Korea, which exists solely to prepare for total war. This isn't just a few thousand shock troops. This is a massive injection of manpower, artillery, and logistics that tips the already precarious balance decisively. The West's manpower crisis is acute. The pool of available, trained, and motivated fighting-age males in the proxy nation is exhausted. They are scraping the bottom of the barrel, fielding men in their 50 seconds and 60 seconds, poorly trained and often sent directly to the grinder. Meanwhile, Russia, bolstered by its own partial mobilization and now by the immense reserves of a North Korean ally, transforms the theater into a true meat grinder, maximizing the very thing the proxy force cannot afford: attrition. This strategic alliance enables Russia to do two things simultaneously. First, to maximize the pressure on the current front lines, exploiting every weakness. And second, to free up their own elite, mobile and technically advanced units, which are often held back as operational reserves for deeper, decisive strikes. The failure diagnosis is simple. We prioritize politics over competence. We allowed institutions like the Pentagon and NATO to become instruments of political conformity rather than centers of strategic thought. Generals are promoted not for their understanding of how to maneuver a heavy brigade in a complex environment, but for their ability to navigate Washington's political currents and deliver the desired talking points. The result? A doctrinal and technological arrogance that dismissed the adversary as backward. We convinced ourselves that sophisticated, complex Western equipment, a few Leopard tanks, A handful of thinly protected Bradleys would somehow negate the overwhelming power of Russian tube artillery, layered defenses, and precision fires. That arrogance has resulted in the literal smoking wreckage of millions of dollars of hardware, and worse, the unnecessary deaths of hundreds of thousands of men. The operational reality is that the front lines have morphed into a late 20th century version of World War I trench warfare, where the advantage lies with the side that can field the most robust, reliable, and voluminous fires, artillery, rockets, and drones, not with the side that relies on finesse and maneuver. The North Korean contribution in this context is not about maneuver warfare. It is about reinforcing the artillery density and human wave potential that defines an attrition war. They are bringing hundreds of thousands of men willing to endure the punishing conditions of the front, allowing the Russian forces to maintain a constant, suffocating pressure. This is the operational trap. The West poured its resources into a counteroffensive that failed spectacularly, wasting its best trained units and most advanced equipment. Now, faced with a stabilized, deeply entrenched Russian defense and the arrival of a massive, motivated reinforcement from North Korea, the West is strategically bankrupt. They have no viable offensive option left. They are now condemned to watching the slow, grinding collapse of their proxy state simply because they fail to understand that the purpose of a military is to deliver lethal force efficiently, not to win arguments on cable news. The integration of North Korean logistics and personnel into the Russian effort is the final, undeniable proof that the geopolitical landscape has shifted irreversibly. The West is isolated, its promises are empty, and the military facts are about to deliver a verdict that no amount of spin can conceal. I told you the party was over. The consequences are just beginning to arrive. What we are witnessing is not merely a clash of armies. It is the death of a flawed military philosophy, maneuver warfare, as practiced by NATO in the absence of absolute air superiority. For decades, the Western military establishment, specifically the U.S. Army, obsessed over the concept of deep thrusts, flanking maneuvers, and rapid, decisive victory. The Schlieffen Plan modernized and Americanized. This doctrine was built on the premise of overwhelming technological dominance and the ability to operate without fear of catastrophic attrition. It worked against disorganized opponents with no air defense, no coherent artillery, and no precision ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. That is not the conflict we are in now. The proxy forces, trained by NATO to execute these quick, shallow maneuvers, failed because they ran directly into the buzzsaw of Russian firepower attrition doctrine. This Russian doctrine, often dismissed as brutal and unsophisticated, is simply a sober recognition of military history and the current technological reality. It is a doctrine that prizes mass, redundancy, depth, and the methodical destruction of the enemy through overwhelming artillery and missile saturation. They do not seek a quick, sexy maneuver. They seek the absolute, irreversible destruction of the enemy's fighting capacity. The drone age has killed maneuver warfare as we knew it. In a world where every square meter of the front is observed by cheap, omnipresent drones, both commercial and military, the element of surprise required for a successful deep maneuver is gone. Moving an entire brigade, thousands of vehicles, is no longer an exercise in fluid movement. It is an act of target identification for enemy artillery. When you attempt to execute a flanking maneuver, the drones spot your concentration. The target data is fed into a highly capable C3I system: command, control, communication, and intelligence. And within minutes, you are subjected to an annihilation strike from thousands of artillery shells, guided rockets, and Lancet loitering munitions. This reality fundamentally validates the Russian approach: stay deep, stay covered, and focus all resources on delivering volume and precision fire. This is World War I all over again, but with GPS accuracy. Think back to the Somme or Verdun. Why did those conflicts become grinding trenches? Because Machine guns and massed artillery made movement suicide. Today, the drone and precision artillery piece are the modern machine gun. Any attempt to mass forces for a breakthrough is met with instant, disproportionate destruction. The proxy army's failed counteroffensive was a perfect case study in doctrinal blindness. They tried to execute a maneuver doctrine in an attrition environment and were bled white for their hubris. Contrast this with the historical realism embedded in the Russian doctrine. They understand that ultimate victory comes from breaking the enemy's will and capacity to fight a lesson learned in the meat grinders of the Great Patriotic War. They are willing to trade space for time, absorb initial shock, and then use their enormous industrial and demographic depth to simply outproduce and outlast the enemy. Their alliance with North Korea is a continuation of this doctrine, an immediate, massive reinforcement of the very elements they need for sustained, high intensity attrition. It secures the manpower and the older, reliable artillery stocks necessary to continue the saturation bombardment, freeing up advanced Russian units for more complex tasks. This is not some desperate measure. It is a calculated strategic move that leverages their alliance structure to cement their tactical advantage. What kind of political leadership looks at this massive commitment of resources and still insists the adversary is weakening? Incompetent leadership. And this brings me to my standard critique: the profound intellectual incompetence that has infected the highest levels of Western military and political leadership. How many of the people making critical strategic decisions in the Pentagon, in NATO headquarters, or on Capitol Hill have any real technical, engineering, or kinetic understanding of modern warfare? Very few. They are largely lawyers, political scientists, economists, or career bureaucrats. People trained in social dynamics, spin, and political expediency, not in logistics, physics, or military engineering. They talk about winning the narrative and sending a strong message, while completely failing to grasp the technical reality of casualty ratios, shell production rates, or the electronic warfare environment. They confuse political resolve with military capacity. This is why they were shocked when the proxy forces failed. They believe their own talking points about superior Western training and equipment delivered by generals who themselves rose through political obedience rather than battlefield command. A Colonel Macgregor, or any technically minded officer, could have told you exactly how many shells and how many men it would take to breach those layered Russian defenses, and that the West was nowhere near supplying those numbers. The intellectual decay is a crisis. When leaders lack the technical background to evaluate the advice they are given, they become hostages to political hacks and the military-industrial complex. They cannot differentiate between sound military planning and a lucrative contract for something that looks good on paper but fails on the battlefield. The core failure is understanding that this is a firepower fight. Maneuver is only possible after you have completely suppressed or destroyed the enemy's ability to observe and fire back. That takes immense amounts of artillery, ammunition, the kind of volumes at the Western industrial base, optimized for peacetime profits and low volume, high cost systems, simply cannot produce. Russia, and now with North Korean support, they have embraced the grind, understanding that the only way to win a war of this scale is to systematically dismantle the opponent's material and demographic base. When I look at the strategic environment, I don't see maneuverability. I see massed fires, hardened positions, and an unavoidable historical pattern asserting itself. The West had every opportunity to read the history books, study the technical parameters of the conflict, and realize that their maneuver doctrine was a dead letter. They chose denial, led by people whose primary competence lies in managing public relations, not prosecuting war. The price of that denial is being paid in blood and national humiliation. The doctrinal defeat is complete. The doctrinal defeat we analyzed in Part 2 is merely a symptom of a far deeper cancer: the systemic institutional failure of NATO and the Pentagon. This failure is rooted in two interacting diseases: political promotion over military competence, and the corrosive, profit driven corruption of the military industrial complex, AMC. You cannot run a successful war machine if the primary metric for advancement is political alignment rather than battlefield performance, and you cannot win a war if your industrial base is designed to maximize quarterly profits instead of maximizing lethal output. We have effectively decoupled strategic reality from the reward system. Let's start with the institutional rot. Why are our leaders so consistently wrong? Because the system is structured to reward self delusion. In the modern Pentagon, the path to a star is not through a successful, decisive, and cost effective military campaign. It's through avoiding controversy, mastering the bureaucratic language of diversity and inclusion, and most importantly, acting as a compliant salesman for the defense contractors. This results in a leadership class that possesses an abundance of social science degrees and political savvy, but a catastrophic lack of technical and operational understanding. When you promote a general who has spent more time in Washington, D.C., lobbying for a bloated budget and commanding a brigade in high intensity combat, you get predictable results. Strategic timidity masked by bombastic rhetoric. The military apparatus becomes an elaborate theater of political correctness and administrative compliance, not a force designed to win wars efficiently. The decisions being made are not based on military effectiveness, they are based on internal power dynamics and the maintenance of lucrative careers. The second, and perhaps more destructive disease, is the MIC. The military industrial complex is not inherently evil, but when its primary function shifts from national defense to profit generation, it becomes a strategic liability. We have a defense industry optimized for low volume, high cost, hyper complex systems that look fantastic on a brochure and guarantee immense profit margins, but which are virtually impossible to maintain, repair, or mass produce under the stress of an attrition war. Think about the production rate of 155 millimeters artillery shells, or the time required to manufacture a single complex tank. These rates are laughably inadequate for the needs of the Eastern European front. Why? Because the system is structurally resistant to efficiency and simplicity. Efficiency means lower profits. Simplicity means less lucrative maintenance contracts. They build systems that are too sophisticated for the proxy forces to operate effectively, require a dedicated Western logistics tail, and can be destroyed by a cheap, mass-produced drone. This is a deliberate design flaw from a strategic perspective, but a perfect business model from a corporate one. Now, look at the technological gap that this corruption has created. The West pours billions into systems that fundamentally fail to deliver kinetic superiority. Take, for example, the Patriot missile system. It is an incredibly expensive, technically complex piece of kit, a shining example of high cost, low volume thinking. On paper, it is a miracle worker. In reality, under sustained, massed Russian missile attack, its performance has been spotty, with its immense cost per engagement often exceeding the cost of the cheap missiles or drones it attempts to intercept. It is a logistical nightmare and a strategic sponge, soaking up scarce resources while failing to provide a comprehensive defense. The attempt to send Western tanks to the front was a similar delusion. They were introduced as psychological and technological game changers, only to be systematically and methodically destroyed by drones, mines, and artillery. The sheer vulnerability of these heavily armored, complex machines in a high firepower environment was completely ignored by the political class because they were too busy selling the narrative of Western technical superiority. Contrast this with the technological focus of Russia. Russia is not chasing low volume complexity. They are pursuing mass reliability and overwhelming kinetic effect. Their systems are designed for simplicity, ease of mass production, and operational redundancy. More importantly, they have invested heavily in genuinely strategic, game-changing capabilities that are untouchable by the West. I'm talking about hypersonic missiles like the Kinzhal weapons that move so fast they render current Western air and missile defenses obsolete. I'm talking about nuclear propulsion systems like the Poseidon or Burevestnik systems that give them effectively unlimited range and invulnerability to current interception methods. While the Pentagon obsesses over the next generation of overpriced, politically correct fighter jet, Russia has been ensuring the inviolability of its strategic deterrent and developing weapons that change the physics of the battlefield. The recent North Korean alliance compounds this advantage by providing reliable, high volume production of conventional weapons and artillery ammunition, freeing up Russian facilities to focus even more intensely on their advanced strategic and tactical systems. The gap is not in ideology, it is in technological priorities. The West prioritizes profit and complexity. Russia prioritizes lethal effect and strategic insurance. The institutional corruption has created a Western military that is exquisitely tailored to fight the wrong war with the wrong tools for the wrong reasons, all while enriching the very people who designed the failure. The only way to bridge this gap is through brutal self assessment and a complete overhaul of the acquisition and promotion system. But the institutions are too bloated, too politically invested, and too financially intertwined with the MIC to reform themselves voluntarily. They will continue to peddle the lie of technological superiority until the facts on the ground become so catastrophic that the political system itself breaks. That moment is fast approaching. The arrival of North Korean forces is not just a deployment of men, it is a declaration that the West's industrial base is being outcompeted and that its political alliances are being exposed as paper thin. We now transition from the failure of conventional doctrine to the truly existential threat to nuclear redlines that the West, in its arrogance and strategic illiteracy, continues to provoke. The institutional failure we discussed isn't just about failing to produce enough artillery. It's about fundamentally misunderstanding the psychological and strategic calculus of a nuclear armed peer adversary, particularly one that perceives itself as being backed into a corner. The expansion of this conflict, formalized by the Russia-North Korea Pact, accelerates the countdown towards strategic miscalculation. To understand the current nuclear risk, you must first understand the great betrayal of 2002, the American withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile ABM Treaty. The ABM Treaty, signed in 1972, was arguably the single most important treaty of the Cold War. Its premise was simple and stabilizing. Limit the deployment of defensive missile systems to ensure that both the US and the USSR remain vulnerable to each other's nuclear retaliation. This concept of mutual assured destruction, MAD, was the terrible necessary guarantor of peace. By limiting defenses, it removed the incentive for either side to launch a devastating first strike, believing they could then shoot down the weakened retaliatory force. When the U.S. unilaterally abrogated that treaty in 2002 to pursue theater missile defense systems, systems designed to counter so-called rogue states, but which Russia saw, correctly, as slowly eroding its strategic deterrent, the compact was broken. Russia's response was entirely predictable and strategically sound. Since the treaty, ensuring the viability of their conventional ICBMs, was gone, they were forced to invest massive resources into developing a new generation of strategic systems that could defeat any current or planned Western missile defense. This betrayal, driven by the same hubris that characterizes the current conflict, directly led to the creation of the terrifyingly advanced weapons we see today. I'm talking about systems like the Burevestnik nuclear-powered cruise missile, capable of virtually unlimited range and unpredictable trajectories, rendering fixed defense grids useless. I'm talking about the Poseidon nuclear-powered underwater drone, a doomsday weapon capable of creating devastating radioactive tsunamis against coastal targets, entirely circumventing traditional air and missile defenses. These are not weapons of choice, they are weapons of necessity, born from a reaction to the West's reckless attempt to gain strategic superiority by dismantling the treaties that maintain stability. The West created the very threat it now pretends to fear. The current red line is kinetic, immediate, and utterly blurred by the dual-use nature of modern weaponry, specifically the Tomahawk cruise missile and similar long-range precision conventional strike systems. These systems are highly accurate and can be launched from land, sea, or air deep into enemy territory. Critically, These missiles are designed to carry either a conventional warhead or a tactical nuclear warhead. The fundamental strategic problem is this: when a Tomahawk is launched toward a strategic asset deep inside Russian territory, or now perhaps from a platform aiding the proxy forces, the adversary has only seconds to detect, track, and identify its nature. Does it carry high explosive, or is it a tactical nuclear strike? They cannot tell the difference. In a high stress, fast moving strategic crisis, particularly with degraded early warning capabilities, the only safe assumption for the defending nuclear power is the worst case scenario, that the incoming missile is nuclear. By continuously supplying and pushing the deployment of long range conventional strike capabilities near or across these red lines, Western leadership is intentionally or ignorantly playing a game of nuclear chicken. This is strategic malpractice of the highest order. The North Korean deployment, particularly if it involves securing forward artillery and missile positions close to or within Russian claimed territory, increases the complexity and the risk. It offers an immense conventional shield to Russian strategic assets, allowing them to operate closer to the line of strategic differentiation. This forces the West to either back down or escalate by deploying even longer range systems, which only heightens the risk of crossing the nuclear threshold. The political class, with its social science degrees and penchant for narrative control, simply does not possess the technical or historical context to understand the catastrophe they are courting. They treat nuclear strategy as an academic exercise, not a life and death calculation involving physics, response times, and irreversible escalation ladders. The generals who understand this are either marginalized or retired. The ones speaking loudest are the political hacks and the MIC spokesman, both of whom profit from the continued escalation. The ABM betrayal set the stage for this new, more dangerous strategic reality. The current kinetic confrontation is the curtain rising on the third act of that tragedy. It demands a level of restraint and technical understanding that is entirely absent in the current Western political structure. We are facing a high speed collision with the reality of MAD, driven by strategic ignorance and political hubris. The military facts, as always, eventually determine the political outcome. The inevitable conventional defeat on the Eastern Front, exacerbated by the massive, unconstrained logistical and manpower injection from the Russia North Korea Pact, will cascade into profound political collapse across Europe and the NATO structure itself. When the public finally grasps the scale of the financial commitment, the grotesque loss of life, and the sheer technological superiority of the adversary, the political systems that champion this catastrophe will break. We are already seeing the indicators. The constant pressure of funding a losing proxy war is exposing the fragility of Western economies and the hollowness of NATO's self-proclaimed unity. The NATO funding crisis will become irreversible. Why should the American taxpayer continue to subsidize the security of nations that refuse to take their own defense seriously, especially when that subsidy is fueling a strategic defeat? The political shockwaves will sweep away the current generation of European leaders who staked their careers on a narrative of Russian collapse. Their replacements will be forced to deal with the bitter, humiliating reality of negotiating peace from a position of profound weakness. The North Korean involvement simply guarantees that this humiliation will arrive faster and with greater finality. The narrative of global NATO and unchallenged Western dominance is dead. What remains is the bill, the body bags, and the shattered credibility of American strategic planning. The ultimate lesson here is the same lesson history provides every time political incompetence trumps military competence. Restraint and reform are the only paths to survival. The West has a choice right now. Choice 1, cling to denial. Continue to funnel arms, money, and political rhetoric into a black hole, doubling down on the disastrous Maneuver Doctrine and the strategic provocation of a nuclear power. This guarantees institutional collapse, economic devastation, and the persistent existential risk of nuclear escalation. Choice 2, accept reality. Call for an immediate pragmatic ceasefire. End the destructive commitment to a lost cause. And most importantly, launch a ruthless, comprehensive reform of the military establishment, purging the political hacks, defunding the parasitic elements of the military industrial complex, and restoring the principle of competence over conformity. The goal of a military is to secure the nation, not to secure corporate profits or political careers. We have failed that primary mission because the people in charge, the political appointees, the lawyers, and the MIC executives fundamentally misunderstood the technical realities of attrition warfare. They replaced strategy with spin. They replaced competence with conformity. The final verdict on this strategic disaster will be determined not in the halls of Washington or Brussels, but on the frozen, missile blasted fields of Eastern Europe, where the cold, hard math of artillery shells, drones, and replacement manpower has already declared the winner. The time for polite academic discussion is over. The time for political posturing is finished. We demand accountability. We demand a complete purge of the incompetent leadership that engineered this disaster. We demand a return to strategic competence, technical realism, and the restraint necessary to keep this conflict from metastasizing into an extinction level event. The only way forward is through brutal, unsparing truth. Anything less is strategic suicide.